Welcome, folks, to this week's Check-In with the Doctor. I am, of course, your host, Chris White, and I'm really delighted to introduce this week's guest. This is a gentleman that I met just recently, had a delightful conversation with, and knew instantly that he was someone that I needed to invite onto the program. His name is Andy Paul, and he's the host of the acclaimed Sales Enablement podcast, now part of Ring DNA. Andy, welcome. Thank you so much for being here, sir. How are you doing?
Chris, well, thank you for having me. I'm doing well. Just rested and refreshed after a long weekend.
That's fantastic. And I know you live in San Diego. So, I have this vision of everyone in San Diego sort of being rested and refreshed all the time, because it's always beautiful weather, and at least that's the perception. So
yeah, it's hard to complain.
Yeah,
let's say that.
Indeed, indeed. Well, Andy, you're pretty well known in the sales enablement space, and honestly, it's a privilege to have you. I know you've interviewed the likes of Daniel Pink and some other very big names in the space. But in the unlikely event somebody in my network does not know who you are, do you mind taking just a minute and introducing yourself a little bit more, elaborately?
Yeah, to start with, I host with podcast has gone through a couple iterations. It started initial life called Accelerate with Andy Paul. Now it's Sales Enablement with Andy Paul. And we're 925 episodes and going strong. Been doing it for close to 6 years. And you said we've had, the best and the brightest minds in sales on the show. And as I tell people, it's the most selfish thing I've ever done, because I've been able to talk to 925 plus really, really smart people. And it's helped me learn a ton as well. So been doing that. Before that, the podcast was acquired a year ago by Ring DNA, and got to start my own company in 2000. Before that, I worked for about 7 or 8 different tech startups. I worked at Apple in the early years, all in sales leadership roles, growing, scaling companies. Yeah. And then with my own company, really focused on working with not raw startups necessarily, but sort of companies reached sort of the 5 million plus revenue, but it sort of stalled out a little bit. And particularly those that were trying to sell strategically into a company, into larger enterprises. So small companies try to sell into big companies. Yeah. And did that, started my podcast, written a couple, Amazon best-selling books. And here we are today. Yeah, that's such an incredible journey. What inspired you to start the podcast to begin with? That's a great question. I attended a conference, and I heard someone speak about podcasting, and just sort of caught my interest. I said, well, that might be fun to try, because it's a great way to create content, but also a great way, as I said before, to learn, to meet people that are doing interesting things and pick their brains. And I think it was more just interest to sort of get involved even more deeply than in the sales world and so on than I was. And hey, it works.
Yeah. Were there things about the podcast and doing a podcast that surprised you early on?
Not really. I mean, I think that sometimes people sometimes people aren't as anxious to talk as you might think they would be, because they want to be on your show, and then they are a little reticent. But I sort of learned that early on, and I sort of over prepare. So we do 3 episodes a week, and I probably have 30 to 40 questions for every guest that I prepare. I don't accept questions from the guests, and I don't provide my questions ahead of time for my guests. So we have a very spontaneous conversation about topics that I choose. If they've written a book, the guest has written a book, I read the books, which is a little different than most podcast hosts. So
that's impressive.
I'll go through and, if they've want to be on the show, then I'll show them the respect of reading their work. And so that's, leads to some interesting conversations sometimes, because you'd be surprised. Sometimes authors can't defend what they write in their books. And I've sort of enjoyed this ability to be able to engage in frank conversations with people and challenge them.
Yeah.
And so the show sort of has a reputation as being a challenging place to come and talk.
Yeah, which is I think powerful. You know, the challenger sale is such a well-known and highly regarded sort of methodology or approach to sales, and it sounds like you're sort of the challenger podcast is sort of what I'm hearing a little bit.
Well, I if somebody has a theory or philosophy or perspective, we'll find out whether they've thought it through, right? And I don't mind, because I think that we're trying to provide a service to the audience of providing access to new voices, right? As one of the things I'm trying to do is I cast a pretty wide net. We get we get probably over 1,000 inquiries a year for 150 episodes. So we get a lot of people that want to be on the show.
Wow.
And what I'm trying to do is choose new voices as much as I can, people that can help sort of push the envelope in terms of how we think about sales and how we think about buying and all dimensions of it, to just lift everyone a little bit and provide them something new to think about.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I'm flattered that you took time out of your busy schedule to join with us today. And
thanks for having me.
And I am curious. I mentioned Daniel Pink, and I know you mentioned to me before that you've had him on the podcast.
Right.
He's one of my favorite authors. I love To Sell Is Human, and I love Drive. In fact, I reference Drive, I think, in my book. What are some of, or if someone asks, or when somebody asks, what's one of your favorite guests, or who has been one of your favorite guests? Is there someone in particular that sort of rises to the top when you hear that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's not always the well-known people, right? I mean, Dan Pink was fascinating to talk to. We talked about his book When, about chronotypes and the time of day when you should be doing things.
Yeah.
But there are other people that maybe aren't as big a names, but I think are just get it, right? Understand sales and what sellers should be doing and the way they should be approaching their job and thinking about it. They're always sort of the most fun to speak with. But there are some big names among them. I really enjoy one guy who's been on the show, I don't know, 3 times now, is Mike Bosworth, who wrote Solution Selling back in the 90s. And I don't think anybody understands sales any better than he does. He's somebody that's always fun to have on the show. Skip Miller's another guy that's and then some newer people, some newer voices coming up. I'm trying to encourage new voices in sales. Ring DNA ran a sort of a book contest, sales book contest about a year ago March. It was a March Madness bracket challenge, we called it. And so because there was no March Madness that year. So there was
that's great.
We nominated 64 books to be in the brackets, and there are multiple rounds of voting. And you looked at the quarterfinalists, and these were all books written by men over the age of 50. And it seemed strange that those should be the books people are still looking to. So not that there's not anything wrong with the books, but we just highlight the fact we need new voices in sales because the world's changing. And so part of what I try to do through the show is, I said, if I find somebody that's writing something interesting online, I think they've got a voice, then I reach out and invite them on the show, and we talk. And I'm running a mastermind group for young sales authors want to write their first sales book. Just finished the first cohort, and we're going to be starting a second cohort soon. I'm just trying to encourage, new perspectives.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So the first message I'm hearing is that if anybody happens to listen to this or be listening, if they're interested in potentially writing a book, or if they think they have a book in them,
contact me.
One option is to speak to you about your mastermind program.
And it's currently still free of charge. We have a limited group that I take each time. And we take them through a curriculum about how to organize the writing and organize what they want to write about. And we bring in a publisher to talk to them and just try to get people energized. And it's really geared for, we're looking for diverse voices, and we're looking for people under the age of 40.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Incidentally, I can speak from personal experience. I actually hired a coach to help me write my first book, and he was very expensive. Well, I might not have qualified for your program because I was already over
right?
40.
Yeah.
When I did that. So incidentally, folks, if any of you have just joined, I'm on with Andy Paul, the host of the Sales Enablement podcast. And incidentally, if anybody cares to say hello or ask Andy any questions, I welcome you to do so. Andy, you mentioned, whenever an author has maybe a framework or a position, you like to sort of do your homework and ask him or her some very pointed questions, and can they back up the framework? Now, in our first conversation, you mentioned that you're working on a book, and you mentioned that to you, sales can be boiled down to 4 things. In fact, you shared 4 words with me. I'd love to have you elaborate on that a little bit. First of all, how do you refer to it? Because I've got my 6 habits. I'm pointing over the wrong shoulder. I've got my 6 habits. Sort of that's my framework. How do you refer to and think of your framework, if you will?
Like on pillars of influence. And what it comes about, this is, it's part of, actually, I've written about these for a long time. And I use different words. I've sort of changed the words a little bit. They mean the same thing. It's just different words. But it's, as I've gone through my career, and I've been in sales for forever, and look back at not only the successes that I've had and what I think the reasons I was able to be pretty successful in my sales career, but also looking at other successful people. And this is not, sort of the mythical top performers or things like that. It's just people that are doing a consistently good job and have built a career out of sales. And some that even were mentors to me. And I look at, what enabled them to be successful in a variety of different conditions. And as I spent more and more time thinking about it and writing about it over especially the last 12 years, is these 4 words just popped out and kept coming back to them time and time again. And again, I call them the pillars of influence, because our job as sellers is not one of persuasion, it's one of influence. And we can spend more time talking about that later. But I think, if you can master some of these 4 pillars, you can almost do anything you want in the sales world. And what they are is they're connection, curiosity, understanding, and generosity. And connection is, can you build a human connection? There's a lot of talk about relationships these days in sales, and I've sort of been on the attack recently on LinkedIn to those people that think relationships aren't important. Friendships aren't important. Relationships are. Connections are. This human connection that leads you the ability to have rapport and build your credibility and trust with another human being, which is still at the heart of selling.
Yeah.
Second is curiosity. It's not the ability to ask a list of questions that you might have developed, but just to be interested not only just in your customers as a customer, your customer as a person, also your curiosity about learning about your product and learning about the customer's business, and just being curious about the world in general. I was telling somebody the other day is that there's a quote from a British philosopher, Thomas Huxley, who wrote in the late 1800s, which I saw early in my career, and I've sort of kept that quote with me all the time. Is he's talking about life. One should try to learn something about everything and everything about something, and you should do that, because I read widely. I scan my entire life. I've read multiple newspapers a day, or scan multiple newspapers a day. Obviously, it's much easier the last 15, 20 years doing that, going online and scanning all these news sources. And my wife always gives me a hard time about how much junk I got stored in my head and ability to pull out random facts about everything. But that ability to do that has enabled me to have conversations with, I've sold on every continent but Antarctica, large systems, the major enterprises, small businesses, large businesses in my career, people across a range of walks of life. And I've been able to build a connection with all of them and to find something in common ground with all of them. And part of that just comes from, I'm just interested in everything, right? Is just a voracious reader and consumer of information. And I think sellers need to have that level of curiosity, not just in their narrow field of interest, but just in general, because that knowledge will come in handy at some point. So curiosity, the second one.
So, and if I can just sort of double click on a few of the words that you use.
Sure.
When you began to introduce the 4 pillars of influence, you said, it's the people that I looked at that were consistently succeeding, right? Mm-hmm. And to me, that's such a true test of performance, is consistency. So I think it's just so, so relevant to double click on that. We can sort of flop into success once in a while, right? Like we can sort of hit the home run once in a while, but these are the things that take, and just that first one, that connection, the word that came to mind for me is authenticity. I think the only way to truly build a connection is to be comfortable in our own skin, authentic, and present an authentic version of ourselves. Does that
yes.
relate to you?
Let's look at it this way. The behavior that buyers don't like is salesy behavior, right? You and I talked about this before. Is what's the one question a customer will never ask you? A customer will never say, Chris, I'd love to buy from you, but you're just not salesy enough. Could you be more salesy? Right? You're never going to get a customer to say that. Negative. Customers resist salesiness. Well, the thing is, so you're about authenticity. Being salesy is not innate human behavior.
That's a good point.
Right? It doesn't come naturally to most people to be salesy. I mean, elements of it could be, there are people who are more self-centered than others, and they'll be more focused on themselves than the other person. But in general, human beings know how to make friends. They know how to connect with other people. I mean, everybody does, regardless of personality type, and that requires a certain level of other centricity to make a friend. So that's just building a connection with someone. Again, we're not trying to make our customers our friends. We're just trying to connect. You do that by being yourself, and not by putting on this sales hat. And I remember my first sales training class I ever went to. Started my career. It's a company called Burroughs. It's now Unisys, at the time, second largest computer company in the world. So every year they hired hundreds and hundreds of new grads and sent us to these training classes at their training centers. And I just remember sitting there looking at the other people in the class, and everybody was just trying so hard to be salesy, because that's sort of what the sales training encouraged you to be. And I remember sort of thinking, I can't be this way. There's no way I'm never gonna survive if I have to act like this. And it's not a personal thing against the other people. It's just I couldn't be that way. So I've spent my career, which much closer to the end of than beginning, is sort of forging my own path to say, how can I succeed in this world and act, be me, not somebody else. So your idea of authenticity is good. It's just be yourself, right? Be true to yourself. Sell in a way that aligns with who you are as a person, what your values are, what your character is. And you're gonna have various points in your career, you're gonna have to resist the pressures from managers and so on to act a certain way. You're always better off just being yourself.
And I want to get back to 3 and 4, but I want to ask you a question on that, because I actually hear this quite a bit in some of the workshops that I run, because we talk a lot about being other-centered, and we talk a lot about accepting the fact that we are simply not going to close every deal. I mean, and we need to respect everyone's right to decide for themselves, right? We need to respect everyone's right to choose, regardless of the conversation. And I frequently get a question similar to what you just asked. Well, how do I handle my sales manager who doesn't seem to understand or recognize these principles that we're talking about here, and doesn't seem to recognize that we can't be certain ways or say certain things or just force certain things. What is your advice to the people that ask that question?
Well, you have to have an alternative, right?
Mm.
So if you don't feel comfortable with what's the methodology is being recommended, what would you do differently? And what are you prepared to commit to do to show that your way works? Right? I mean, it's we've gotten so burdened down in this whole world of activity metrics and so on. And yeah, we all have ratios throughout our career, right? You look at our track record, we all have ratios. Those don't go away, and they're useful to know. But yeah, my ratio is not the same as somebody else's, and nor should they expect that one size fits all. So yeah, in my career, it's just a matter of saying no. And showing that I could deliver, doing it my way. And we had the same expectations. When I started my career, we left the branch office every morning at 8:30. The boss came in and turned out the lights in the sales room, which meant we had to go. And we'd drive to a business park, and this is San Francisco Bay Area. I'd drive to a business park and get out and make calls. If you didn't have a pipeline. And so the expectations were there, but I just, even from the beginning, did it differently. A lot of my peers were out making 30, 40 calls or whatever, they're cold calls. I decided what I would do is hold a seminar in my branch office every week. And this was pre-email. I'd send out 15 postcards. I'd go to the local business directory, Hoover's, selling to the construction industry, and I was selling a software package for construction accounting. And I would send out 15 invitations, follow up like hell. If I could get 3 to 4 to come into the office each week and do a demo. Actually, sometimes the sales engineer would do the demo. And then, but I could do it myself. But then that's how I built my pipeline. Because, I didn't want to go out in the field and make a bunch of calls. And I felt this was a much more effective use of my time. Well, President's Club, my first 3 years, promoted to management real quickly. And so that gave me the confidence that no matter what situation I could get into, or I would get into, or find myself, that I'd be able to find a way that I could sell that was aligned with who I was, that was effective and productive. So it's just having some confidence.
Again, what's that?
It's just a matter of having some confidence and I say courage with a very small c, to say, I believe that I can get this done.
Well, so those two words are so critical as well: courage and confidence. And you're right. I think we have to know ourselves, and we have to know what's comfortable for us. And you're right. Salesy isn't sort of a natural trait, right? It's, in fact, I would say, probably the layperson's definition of salesy is artificial, right? I mean, sort of, shining the apple, so to speak. Incidentally, folks, and Andy, let me pause just for a moment. So, folks, I'm on with Andy Paul. He's the host of the Sales Enablement podcast, and we're talking sales, and we're talking through the 4 pillars of influence, as he likes to refer to them. If you have any questions, by all means, I invite you to share them. Otherwise, Andy, we'll just carry on.
Sure.
So we've talked about connection, and we've emphasized the importance of authenticity and just really truly connecting with people. We've talked about a little bit about curiosity, and I love that example of you should know something about everything and everything about something. I mean, that, again, such simple words, but such a powerful message. Now, there's 2 more words in your 4 pillars of influence that we haven't gotten to. Let's go to number 3.
Well, 3 is understanding. And This is important on so many levels. One is if you take sort of the typical, let's say, discovery call that sellers do, and they ask questions and you get some information back. All you have at that point is a collection of information. It doesn't mean that you actually understand anything. You don't understand what the buyer's really trying to achieve. You don't necessarily understand the buyer's problem they're trying to solve. And that's a huge gap between knowing and understanding. And so transiting that gap, crossing that gap to the level of point of understanding is really important. And so, because without understanding, how can you sell to somebody if you don't understand? Right? I mean, think about why buyers react negatively to sellers that show up and pitch them. Well, you're proposing, in essence, you're pitching me a solution and you don't understand what my problem is. And you don't think that's problematic? Of course it's problematic in the minds of the buyer. This, sort of stereotypical sales behavior. It's salesy behavior. So the understanding really becomes critical. And you think about, a lot of times in sales, you're asking a question, you'll see the seller, if you're listening to a recorded call, the seller responds quickly because they're just listening to respond. They're not listening to understand. And so this whole idea of understanding and taking to the next level is vital, because you can't really help the buyer. You can't really help them solve their problem without truly understanding it. And also without truly understanding the buyer themselves, right? Because when you think, everybody talks about empathy, and empathy is important, but there's sort of three types of empathy. There's emotional, compassionate, and cognitive empathy. And I would say that the one that's most important for sellers to have is the last one, cognitive empathy, which is not that, so the compassion empathy is, I know how you feel, right?
I empathize, right? I do,
I know how you feel, meaning I acknowledge that you have these feelings. Cognitive empathy is, I understand why you feel the way you do. And that's really important for us as sellers. It's not enough to know that they're feeling this pain or this whatever, if it's a pain point they have or whatever they're feeling about the business. It's not enough to know that they feel that. You need to understand why they feel that. And so this requires that you keep asking questions, that you keep, trying to confirm your understanding of what it is the buyer thinks about the problem, what they think about the scope and the nature of the problem, and what they think about the outcomes they're trying to achieve. That is really critical. So you have to go the step beyond of just knowing and get to that level of understanding. And I said, it's not always just a matter of getting the customer to confirm it, but there's actually a structure when people sort of three layers of understanding that people go to get through from where they start to understanding a problem or a solution. Both the buyers go through it and we go through it as sellers. There's the first stage is not knowing stage. I mean, you don't know what you don't know. There's an uncertainty stage, which is, I think I get it, but probably some factors at work here that still could affect the outcome. So I still need to do some digging. And then there's the understanding stage. Well, your buyers go through those stages. They're trying to understand their problems and the potential solutions and options they have for solving a problem. You go through the same stages of understanding when you're trying to come to grips with what is the problem they're trying to solve and what are the outcomes they're trying to achieve. And I think another very simple way to think about selling and incorporating this word understanding is that your job as a seller is nothing more than listening to understand the most important thing to the buyer and then help them get that. That's your job. Right? Understand what's the most important thing for the buyer and then help them get that. That's sales in a nutshell.
Such powerful words. And as you were speaking, I found myself thinking, it's so difficult for so many people to do what we're saying. And I'm leading the witness a little bit. I have a perception as to why that is. I have a perception as to why even people who might be listening to this, who know in their head, they know in their minds that these are true principles and the right approach, they don't necessarily always practice it in the field. Why do you think that is? I have my perception, but I'm curious to hear yours.
Well, fear is sort of the primary reason, right? Is that frontline managers operate from a position of fear. And the more you focus as a frontline manager on the numbers and the less you focus on the people, the more you're going to be afraid of missing out, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one of the conundrums that persists, and it's hard for people to deal with. I think as an individual, though, it's trusting in yourself ultimately at the end of the day, that if these things make sense to you, that if you apply them consistently, if you do the hard work, we all need to do the hard work. If we're creative about how we approach our work, then you give yourself a better chance of success. Because if you're constantly selling in a way that doesn't feel authentic to you, doesn't align with who you are as a person, you're going to burn out, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to leave sales. And over the course of my 4 decades plus in sales, I've seen hundreds of people leave the profession for just these reasons. Is like, I just don't feel comfortable doing what I'm being asked to do. Hey, I didn't either. And so, but I thought I could make a nice career in sales, and it's turned out to be a fabulous career in terms of the opportunities afforded me and the people I've met and the places I've traveled and all these things. But I was only able to do it because I said, I think there's a better way, and it's my way. And it didn't mean I stayed within my comfort zone. I kept pushing myself. I kept learning, but I had a vision of what it was like and the way I needed to sell, and stayed true to it.
When I hear you say that, I'm reminded of something that I learned over 15 years ago now. I went through a career planning program about 15 years into my career, and that was what encouraged me and gave me the confidence to move into sales, incidentally. And one of the analogies that this gentleman gave me was, cats can climb trees, but squirrels live in them. So are you a cat in a tree, or are you a squirrel in a tree?
Well, that's interesting. I like that.
Right? It's good. And this is kind of what you're saying, right? Like, okay, you might be sort of, applying these methods, but is that really who you are, right? Is that really you? And I think those people that don't succeed and or last and say, or if it just feels uncomfortable, right? If we're doing something day in and day out that just doesn't feel right, it's simply not sustainable. The other thought that came to mind that I'm inclined, you mentioned sort of the 3 steps, and or sort of the 3 stages
of understanding,
right? From knowing, and I love, by the way, I love that, and I love the comparison between knowing and truly understanding. But one of the things that we talk about in some of the workshops I run is there's 3 levels of needs typically from the customer. There's the stated need, the unstated need, and the unstated emotional need. And it's not until we can get to that unstated and address the unstated emotional need that we really have an opportunity to solve, right, and deliver those solutions. So to me, that aligns with what you're saying, is really getting to the why. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah. I mean, I'd phrase it a little differently, personally, in the way I look at things, which is that, I think, contrary to sort of popular belief, I think that most decisions that buyers make are actually fairly rational. So I'll explain why. So Herbert Simon was a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and a lot of his research has affected a lot of us in many ways. And so one of the things he developed was this theory of bounded rationality. And what he said was that when people make decisions, they have 3 constraints: time, information, and understanding. And so the way that most business to business buyers work is that, and so he came up with this idea, backtrack science. So he came up with this idea with bounded rationality, that people will research to solve the problems until they hit upon a solution that does 2 things. It satisfies their requirements, and it's sufficient to achieve their desired outcomes. And he created a word that conjoined those two words called satisfice. And a satisfice decision is what's called a good enough decision. Now, people do that. Our buyers do this. Yes, they could keep on talking to vendors and vendors, but typically when they reach a point where they find a solution that satisfies the requirements and is sufficient to help them achieve their desired outcomes, they stop looking and make a decision. Now, that decision to stop looking is rational. It's not emotional. It's not logical. A good enough decision is a rational decision, because what they're saying is, I could continue to invest time and effort into researching additional solutions, but the marginal return to me for that effort is zero.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying there aren't emotional aspects to decision making, but in the vast majority of cases, people make the good enough decision.
Yeah.
And when they do that, that's a rational choice.
Yeah.
And so what it means for you as a seller is you want to be the first seller that helps the buyer reach that point, right? Where they have this vision of success in their head that satisfies the requirements and is sufficient to meet their desired outcomes.
Yeah. Incidentally, Christopher Richardson tuned in or chimed in. Good enough is good enough. Perfectly well said, Christopher. By the way, it's good to see you. No, that there is so much truth in that notion, that bounded rationalism. Is that the right term?
Bounded rationality, yeah.
Bounded rationality. And you're right. We have time, information, and understanding. And you're right. It just gets to a point where the effort to learn more isn't worth getting a slightly better solution. So, it's interesting. I may spend some more time thinking about that, because I think some people come to decisions more, like I come to decisions quite quickly, and I can make decisions like this quite quickly. I think other people have to over analyze sort of every angle. So I'm sure there's a lot more sort of research on that.
Yeah. So I mean, Simon said there's other groups of people they're called maximizers, and the maximizers are going to look at every single potential solution in order to satisfy themselves that they're making the absolute best choice. Now, the problem, and Barry Schwartz talks about this in his book, The Paradox of Choice, says that, the research found that the maximizers are actually more likely have buyer's remorse, most likely to be unhappy customers, because they're always going to be convinced they missed something that was going to be better.
Right.
But we all sit on a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
Between satisficer and maximizer. And so, like mindsets in general, right? Growth mindset, fixed mindset, we're all on the spectrum between the two endpoints. And that's true here, and your customers will be. So there are emotional aspects to it. To your point is, and Simon talks about this in his work, is that, anyone that's involved, any stakeholder you have in a decision, they're going to be looking at the decision from two perspectives, right? Well, this is a great decision for the company. Is this a good decision for me personally?
Right.
And so you have to factor that in when you arrive at, the satisfied choice or ultimate decision. These factors play as well. So it is complex.
Yeah.
And the person's, individual perspective on it is, has some emotions tied up to it. Absolutely.
So at the end of the day, it takes us right back to the word understanding, right? So we not only do we have to understand their emotions and their feelings and their reasons and the why, but we also have to understand who they are. Are they a maximizer? Are they a satisficer, right? Or and where in the middle are they? All those things. So fantastic. And I love when things come full circle.
Well, yeah, but it's, you have, to your point precisely, is when you are qualifying buyers, in which you do it throughout your buying cycle, is, depending on what you're selling, you have to make a choice, if they are a maximizer, whether you're going to sell to them or not. Exactly. I had a client years ago that was a large seller of residential solar systems. And I was working with their franchise operation. I was working with their franchise owners around the country. And that's one of the things we went through is, if you have a homeowner that says, oh yeah, we're going to look at 10 different vendors, it's like, don't bother, right? Go to the next one. It's a lot of people that you can talk to, big ocean, because they're maximizers. They'll consume your time. And at the end of the day, they may not make a decision. because they're paralyzed.
Yeah. Well, and it's in my workshops, one of the things I ask the folks is, should we be trying to close every single lead we get? And of course, it's a little bit of a trick question,
Sure.
but there's a lot of people who say, yes, we should. And I say, do you have any customers you wish you didn't have? I mean, there's some real truth to that. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think sellers should change their perspective. Instead of looking as them being the supplicant out trying to sort of beg people to buy from them, they should say, look, I've got a solution, and I'm more like the bouncer at the head of the velvet rope trying to get into a club, and I'm going to make the decision whether you get into the club or not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, if one of the things that we say in one of the early conversations is, look, we have a fantastic solution, it's not right for everyone. So part of what I want to do is sort of make sure that this might be the right fit for you, right? Because that makes the prospect say, who are you saying this isn't right for? Are you,
yeah.
Right? So
yeah, I worked for a guy who was very good at using that, except he'd use it a little bit later when I was early in my career. I had a boss who was, we'd be in meetings, and I remember one of my first big deals I was working on, and he'd say, I just don't think this is going to work. And I thought we were negotiating a deal, and this was at this time multiple hundreds of $1,000s, millions in today's dollars. And he says, because our product's really for companies who are really serious about solving this problem. And and I'm like wide-eyed thinking, oh shit, this is going south in a hurry. But it's sometimes you got to say that if in the right situation.
They want to prove to you that they are the right client or the right company. So we've hit 3: connection, curiosity, and understanding.
Sure.
Let's take it home with the 4th pillar of influence.
Yeah, it's generosity, right? Yeah. I mean, generosity is well, let me give backstory. So have you ever read Give and Take by Adam Grant?
I have not.
Okay, so great book. I recommend all sellers read it. And he said, people in life sort of fall into 3 categories. They're givers, takers, and matchers. And you can sort of understand just from the words, people primarily take, there's people that primarily givers, and then there's people that give as much as they receive, matchers. And I'm hopefully he's not listening to this. I'm generalizing horribly, but what Adam Grant found is in studies is that when they studied people who succeeded, is at the bottom of the list were givers. They're matchers, takers, givers were at the bottom, but the punchline is at the top were also givers. But they were givers that weren't the altruistic givers. They were givers that I call them givers with an agenda, right? And that's part of being generous is, we want to be giving. We do want to openly help, but we're not doing it without some bounds, right? Yeah. And it's okay for the customer to understand that the only way that you succeed is if they succeed. And therefore you want to give the value they need to be able to make the good enough decision. And do it freely, and do it openly, and do it in a way that makes them feel understood and makes them feel valued. And if you can do that, then again, you'll succeed.
Yeah. Well, and the word that comes to mind for me when I hear generous is abundant and an abundance mindset. And because there's so many ways in which we can be generous. We can be generous with our time. We can be generous with our emotions. We can be generous with our patience, right? So to me, I love the notion of the disruptive truth, right? Those things that when you hear sort of challenge the way you otherwise think of the world. And I think for a lot of people to hear generous as one of the 4 pillars of success or influence is sort of disruptive, because I don't think we necessarily think of salespeople don't necessarily think of themselves as generous, but I think it's such a powerful message, right?
Well, I think they don't I'm sorry, go ahead.
No,
Well, I
no,
was gonna say, they oftentimes don't think of themselves as givers.
right.
I mean, I think salespeople probably more often think I'm a taker. And yeah, if you're going in and pitching someone without understanding, then yeah, you're taking, right? You're
Yeah.
taking their time
Yeah.
without giving them anything of value in return for that time. And that's
Yeah.
another part of generosity is always be mindful of the fact that customers are calculating a return on the time that they invest in you, the time and attention they invest in you. And if you're not able to provide them a return on that time and attention, then you're not going to get any more time and attention. So that's part of being foresightful and being generous is, how can I help them achieve what they want to achieve, right? For me, I think about value because that's in danger of being overused cliche in sales, right? As we're going to provide something of value.
Yeah.
A really another simple way to think about what constitutes value in sales is that the buyer, at the end of an inner sales touch, at the end of an interaction with you, they're closer to making a decision than they were before they started the interaction.
Absolutely.
That's it. If you want to think about value,
Yep.
because value can come in any form. It can be a question, it can be data, a white paper, case study, an insight, a challenge. But the point is it only has value to the buyer if they've made progress as a result of receiving it.
Yeah. Well,
So,
I'll take that even a step further. You said closer to making a decision. That doesn't mean necessarily closer to a win, right? Not necessarily, because at the end of the day, we may not win, but I'd still rather be closer to the decision one way or the other, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So closer to the decision is positive, right?
Right.
The other thought that I had, Andy, I'm inspired to share is this notion of generous. I know for me, and I'm not batting 1,000 in reminding myself of this. I wish I was, but as often, and nobody's, as often as I can, though, I try to remind myself that if I've got 30 minutes with someone, an hour, even if it's 5 minutes, if nothing else, I want to make this 30 minutes worth their time.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make this a worthwhile conversation, whether I close it or advance the deal or not. At least it was an engaging and informative conversation, and one that they would look forward to again. And I think if we could all develop that mindset, I think we'd be so much better off. And if I may, Eric Garland was with us. Eric, thanks for chiming in. He shares his observation. Sales engineers are the givers. Now, ironically, you and I talked about this a little bit, right, off air, so to speak, and you shared an observation about sales engineers. When you think of the sales engineer, what is your perspective of the pre-sales engineer?
Well, and the comment I made, which is I absolutely believe, is that sellers in general should act more like sales engineers. And I'll tell you that sort of the background from it. So in my career, throughout my careers, is running teams, is working in very technical fields, spent a long time in the satellite communications area, is I sort of made a career out of bringing people from engineering into sales. And the first response almost universally when I approached the person about it was, I can't sell. I said, and my response was, well, that's great, because that's not your job. Your job is to help solve somebody's problem. Oh, I can do that. I do that all the time. Great. That's the job. And if more sellers had that perspective of what they're trying to do, is that their job is to go in and help somebody, not decide to buy your product, is to have somebody decide how they want to solve their problem. Now, your job is to influence the choices and trade-offs they make. So when they make that choice about, this is how I want to solve my problem, not who do I want to solve it with, but how I want to solve my problem, that, it's the solution is built around your solution.
Yeah.
And that's, sellers should be approaching sales like, your design, like maybe you're selling a chip and you're trying to get that designed into a larger design, right? Yeah. every sales basically like that. You're trying to get your solution designed into a larger system, whether it's the buyer's overall system for X, or, smaller system, or even a technology product, trying to get a chip designed into or something. That's the perspective you need to have.
Yeah.
How am I going to get myself designed into the buyer's vision of success?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, of course, that's music to my ears, being from the sales engineer side of the house and working largely with sales engineers. Of course, I have quite a few pre-sales that listen to the show. And again, what I love about this coming full circle, right, is how do we solve the problems of our customers? Making a connection, being curious, truly understanding not only how they feel, what they're trying to accomplish, but the why behind it. And then being generous with their time, being generous with our, I mean, to me, that seals the envelope. So, I mean, I just love it.
And I long ago have rejected this notion which still persists this day, right? Sales engineers, they don't have the people skills to be a seller. It's like, seriously? I mean, they don't have friends in their life. They don't have relationships in their life. They don't, yeah. I mean, gosh, every profession, people run a spectrum, right? Yeah, I had one client I worked for 3.5 years. The number one seller that I brought over from engineering was pathologically shy. I mean, seriously, customers loved him. He crushed it, right? When he was talking to a customer, I mean, he knew their solutions, he knew their problems, understood, he took the time to really understand their needs. Yeah. Incredible salesperson. Yet, 3 years later, we could sit in the lunchroom and he couldn't bring himself to say hi to me. But, it's all types, right? Yeah. He had people skills, even though he was shy and you wouldn't have thought to interview him, put him in front of a customer, he was dynamite. Yeah. In his own way, right? Yeah. In his own introverted way. Fantastic. Well,
and that comes back to that authenticity. And look, I'm the first to admit, and you've seen it, we've all seen it, that sales engineers, sometimes we are our own worst enemies. Sometimes we do get overly technical. Sometimes we do confess, voluntarily confess our sins, as I like to say, right? And other things, right? So, there are things that we need to work with, but I do think, and I've said this for years, I think the sales engineers need to sort of take a step towards their sales counterparts, and the sales folks need to take a step towards their sales engineer counterparts, right, in terms of the way they approach. And I think the closer we are to the middle, the better off we tend to operate as both teams.
I agree.
Andy, you have been so generous, if I can use that term, with your time. We're going to land this plane here in a minute. The runway is at least in sight. May I indulge you for just a few more minutes?
Sure.
Okay, and then I'll. As you know, a lot of the folks that I work with are sales engineers. A lot of them give demos. I'm curious, have you ever either been involved in a demo or given a demo yourself that didn't go particularly well, shall we say?
Yeah.
And if so, why? Do you remember one instance that went particularly poorly?
Oh, I mean, there's so many that went badly, it's hard to remember, pick out one of them. Yeah, because my career spans a long time. So a lot of this technology was pretty new that so yeah, I mean, demonstrations of computer systems where the computers just didn't work, right? Yeah. These things, weekly things I talked about, yeah, they could go great for 2 months, then one day the computer just decided to not boot or something. Yeah, I mean, setting up communications or satellite communications demonstrations that we're going to a foreign country and trying to acquire satellites and get access to the satellites. And I mean, it's complexities. I've had to just imagine, if you could, many a demo. Yes. Yeah. This is what it would look like if it was working. This is what it would look like. This is what it is doing right now.
And then you sort of have to just navigate your way through it. How about the flip side? Have you been on the receiving end of a demo anytime recently that was particularly engaging, particularly impressive, and sort of left sort of a mark with you, so to speak?
No, not really. I mean, it's nothing that's impressed me as, oh wow, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And why do you think that? Why do you think that is? Do you think people just in general still struggle with, quote, demonstrating value in some of the things that we're talking about here today?
yeah, people still focus a lot on features, functions,
Yeah.
and not trying to incorporate this into sort of a story basis, right? Is so
Mm,
simple questions you can ask is if you're doing a demo is along the lines of, so okay, imagine so who would be using this in your shop? Okay, Jennifer. So what would the day like be for Jennifer if and then you start walking through a story around the
right.
and you try to personalize it to an individual and to an
Right.
organization and back to this person. You just have to, if you tell it more in a story format,
Right.
which is what I try to do, is always,
Right.
personalize it that regard. Then I
Yeah.
think people respond much better, and they can then also envision. And that's what we're trying to do, is you're trying to get people to envision what it would be like to actually use this.
Yes.
And that then builds up into ultimately what I call the vision of success. This is, when they make the decision, the good enough choice is this vision of success that really drives that. The demos play a part of that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So Andy, last question before I
Sure.
invite you to just share a few closing thoughts. If you could ask me one question, what might it be?
Uh, what's the one thing about sales that sales engineers wish they knew most?
What's the one thing about sales that sales engineers wish they knew
Or
most?
most wish they knew, yeah,
Yeah,
with
that's a
better
really good
English.
question. I think I think they wish they understood the right level of detail to go to. I think so many sales engineers, so many of us enter a meeting or a sales engagement, and we struggle with finding the right sort of level to aim at and shoot for. And we are, I think, notoriously afraid of not saying the right thing. And every time we engage, our credibility is on the line. And
Sure.
we are most concerned about losing credibility in front of people. So I think that's the thing that people wish that they knew more of was, and by the way, this is one of the things that I talk about certainly in the book and in the workshops. The partnership with sales is so critical,
Hmm.
and having that effective communication and collaboration going in, we as sales engineers are always looking for more guidance from our sales counterparts. And I think a lot of times we're afraid to ask what might seem like the obvious question. We always seem to feel like we're supposed to have all the answers and know all the
Right.
answers. And we just aren't. We're just human people.
Yeah.
We're just human beings too. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple pieces of advice is, one is experiment instead of staying quiet and being afraid of asking. Is
it's good.
experiment, right?
Yeah,
Say something. If it's the wrong thing, then you learn from it. It's the only way.
absolutely.
Instead of never asking it and never learning, ask and learn. So experiment. If you're worried about the level of detail that you're going to get into with a customer or buyer, ask questions.
Yeah,
Is that enough? Right?
yeah,
Yeah, you confirm whether they understand. Yeah, a great question to ask anybody, a buyer in particular. But if you're a sales engineer, is maybe you've laid something out. You then want to get their confirmation that, hey, they understand what it is, and then ask something like, so okay, we've got that, but what are we missing?
yeah,
What are we missing?
yeah,
That's a great question. If you think the customer they've confirmed back to you, hey, this is the way we want it. This is our requirements. Okay, but what are we missing?
yeah.
Go that extra mile. And then lastly is, this is a hard one for sales engineers, but stop being so deferential to salespeople.
Yeah,
You're in it together. They're
yeah,
not the boss, and they may not be right.
Yeah.
Part of the value of having multiple people interacting with a buyer is that you get multiple perspectives, and everybody walks into a situation with their biases intact. And your job as a sales engineer is not to just blanket agree with the seller. If you got a different perspective, voice it and to bring it to the table.
Yeah. Well, and I'll even take that a step further. I think, and this is one of the things that I tell the sales engineers I work with, our sales counterparts want to believe that we are as invested in this opportunity as they are. They want to believe that we care. And the only way that you're going to show them that you care is to challenge them. If you're sincerely concerned about the best way to close this deal, raise that concern, because that's what they want to do, right? So I call it the 51-49 rule. What's the 51-49 rule? They have 51% of the vote. I get 49% of the vote, right? It's an equal playing field, but I give you the last vote, because at the end of the day, your head is on the line, right? At the end of the day, you're responsible for closing the deal, but it has to be very much an even, sort of ownership on, with regard to the opportunity. So
yeah. I said, don't be so deferential.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's fantastic. So we're just a minute past the hour here, Andy. You've been so gracious and generous with your time. Just closing thought for you. You have a book coming out shortly.
Well, February 2022.
Okay, so February. So the book's coming out. Now,
It feels just around the corner, yes.
Does the book have a title yet, or no?
Not that we're sharing quite yet. Yes, it does, but in a month or so, we'll have that nailed down. We'll start sharing it.
Okay. And people can obviously find you on LinkedIn. They can follow you, your podcast.
iTunes, Spotify, you listen to podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. Yeah, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul.
Fantastic. Andy, thank you so much. You have been
Chris, thank you.
Absolute delight. And I know my audience has enjoyed this and will enjoy the recording. So I look forward to following your stuff, and I hope to have you back on the show sometime.
Great, would love it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And anybody who hung around, thank you so much. And I hope for those of you who catch the recording, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thanks all. Bye-bye.